Morning. Week. Anything? Better. We're here to talk about technology and conservation. Specifically, we're going to talk a lot about the ocean, at least to start, and then we'll probably expand it. So what's really interesting about these guys and this space is, if you think about the history of conservation, sort of the old model was set things aside, keep them pristine, a national park, no one goes in there, and then we sort of set it and forget it. Sort of as humanity's footprint is growing and as we're understanding the broader connections of global systems, we're realizing that this model might not be so effective. Things we do here will affect the oceans, the reserves, the national parks, and we have to really start taking a more active and proactive role in conservation and sort of preventing the damage that we're doing to the environment. And technology is allowing organizations like these guys to really do that and take conservation to a much more active place. We're just sort of at the beginning of this movement. I don't know if you guys saw the Air Shepherd presentation out there yesterday, but there's lots of interesting things with drones and monitoring and big data that is just starting to influencing the conservation movement. We're going to start off with some short presentations with these guys about their work, and then we'll have a little conversation. So, Travis, you want to get started?
Yeah, sounds good.
Great.
All right. So, good morning, everyone. I have the distinct privilege of representing Salesforce.org on stage here today. Talk a little bit about a project that was kicked off early kind of part of this year / last year, and was sort of it took some interesting twists and turns. And I think when I think about the notion of innovation's a really messy business. It's really hard to describe how messy innovation can be. And I think the project that we worked on that I'll tell you a bit more about here is indicative of that. So first off, why is Salesforce on stage talking about environmentalism and conservation of wildlife? Well, it kind of started here. Just a brief background on kind of who we are from an organization perspective. Mark Benioff started Salesforce.com back in 1999. He's very fond of saying that he founded the 1-1-1 model, which was 1% of our products, 1% of our resources, 1% of our time. And 1% at that time was pretty much nothing. So it didn't really hurt him a whole lot to kind of come forward with this plan. Fast forward 17 years, and actually now it's a pretty significant chunk of investment on all three of those fronts. So the numbers are there, 28,000 nonprofit organizations using our technology, over $120 million in grants to the community. And interestingly, 1.4 million volunteer hours from our organization of roughly 22,000 employees. So this project really took flight because of that last metric, the volunteer hours. So the team that was involved with this was entirely made up of pro bono volunteers. And the reason why I bring that up is because innovation in and of itself actually just takes advantage of one key thing, which is the combination of passion and skill. And as it turns out, this group of people that you see on this slide represents a lot of skill, certainly in what they do, whether they're a UX designer, or they're somebody who spends their day in and out thinking about development. But most importantly, they had a passion for one key thing. They have a passion for the ocean. And when I asked internally at Salesforce, hey, if you'd like to be a part of this project, let me know. And I had more responses than I knew what to do with. So it was kind of an interesting experiment to see how could we take these resources and apply them in a meaningful way. So what are we trying to tackle? As it turns out, this is a pretty big problem, this whole sustainability in the ocean piece. And you might not know this, but the seafood counter in your local grocery store is the only place you can go in that store and mistakenly buy an endangered species. Didn't know that. It's not like you can go to the chicken counter or the celery counter and buy an endangered celery or chicken, right? So this is the situation. And as it turns out, in the US, estimates say that a third of the seafood that you see on the counter in your grocery store is probably illegally caught. So what does that mean? Why is that important? Well, this whole global business of IUU, you'll see that term kind of show up from now and again in this presentation. IUU is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. It's a global business, and it's estimated at $10 billion. The reason why there's an asterisk there is actually we don't have any idea. It's somewhere between 10, could be up towards the 23 million, and affects 230 million people. It's a really, really interesting problem. It's really hard to track. It's really hard to know how serious of a problem this is, and that's kind of the state of, I think you'll hear that from Brad as well, the significant issues in the ocean are really, really hard to manage on data. So what's the big deal? Well, as it turns out, the technology that we talk about in this conference and using software and using cloud and mobile and social technologies are really great, but at the same time, the rest of the world has been really innovating in what they do, which is catching fish in this case. So this is a drift net. This is a mile-long piece of technology that fishermen have created, and it's really effective at what it does. So it actually catches fish, but it actually catches 5 pounds of other things for every pound of thing it's supposed to catch. This is an illegal device, and they are all over the ocean. This is a map that you might have seen, a map representing the internet traffic in the world and showing kind of how the connections traverse our planet. This is kind of the inverse. This is actually looking at a density map of marine fishing traffic in the open ocean. And pretty much the whole open ocean is lit up with traffic. So this is a very busy place, meaning that we have technology that is spread out pretty far, and it's a pretty serious issue. And as the statistic shows, 90% of the world's fisheries are exploited, and that's a big issue. So this isn't just about the fishing industry. This isn't about just kind of biodiversity. This is actually about thinking about the future of us, humans. There is an element of this industry that, left unchecked, will really affect the human race. So, case in point, human trafficking is very, very closely correlated with illegal fishing. There's a report out that says that 59% of the people who work in the illegal fishing trade have witnessed a murder of one of their coworkers. It's unbelievable. 3 years at sea, 20-hour days, and no pay. And it's only growing. So as it turns out, as we think about this problem, you know, the ocean is actually it's a pretty easy place to hide. You can kind of check out and do some pretty bad things there. And why is that? Well, it covers 71% of our planet. Most of us know that statistic, but you might not know that 45% of the planet is covered by a pretty much an open ocean. It's the high seas, they call that term, which is the EEZ, the Exclusive Economic Zone. That's a place where it's kind of unregulated by the boundaries of the countries. So it's this sort of we the people version of laws versus Nigerian law or US law. And it's very, very difficult to manage this space, not only because it's 200 miles offshore, but it's really hard to get to, and it's big. So what can we do? Well, we can try to track the vessels that are out there doing these bad things, but the problem is they're really good at hiding. So the two vessels you see at the top are actually the same vessel. These are really, really large vessels. So you'd think that if they're really big, they're kind of easy to spot. You can kind of check them out. You can see the numbers that are on the hull. But they're really good at doing things like changing their name, changing their flag, changing characteristics, changing their color, literally taking out the ship to sea and painting the entire vessel an entirely different color while it's out in the open ocean. Pretty amazing. And they do this to avoid detection. So when you come back into port, or they drop off their next load of $1 million, $5 million, $10 million worth of illegally caught fish, well, nobody knows who they are because they have a new flag, they have a new identity, and they have a new paint job. So it's a pretty amazing thing. And the reality here is that we knew all along what we needed to do, which was actually pretty simple, and that's actually kind of how Salesforce came into this problem. Oceana had this great report 5 years ago, and they said we need centralized data surveillance systems, and we kind of have to get along. We have to collaborate. We have to work together. So they probably had this right all along, and we got together with an organization at UCSB, real scientists, not us, and looked at this problem from a technology front. So how could social, mobile, open technology, stuff that all of us know pretty well at this point, be applied in this context of really difficult challenges? So Mazu was born, and we kicked this project off, and I'll show you a demonstration. I think demos are great because it kind of shows an example. If I had a safe harbor slide, I would show it to you right now because this is concept only, and we are working through that process of messy innovation on this. But if we can go ahead and cue the video, I'll walk you through kind of an experience of what this application can provide. So first we're going to go on a trip. We're going to go out to Indonesia, where there's a vessel sighting. And this vessel sighting, this is real footage from an offshore group of patrol men that are in a boat like this. And they're going to encounter a vessel that looks like this. And this is great. It's a vessel. It's out in the sea. They have no idea who this is. They don't know where they've come from. What can they do? Well, they're going to open up their app on their smartphone. They're going to log into this Mazu application. They're going to log in. They might have a login. It might be anonymous. And they're going to take a look at what they see. Here's the vessels that are nearby to them with the details they need to know exactly what they look like, the photos, last known location. Think of like a bio, most wanted list. So as they're going through the photos, they're checking this out. And this looks potentially like a match to what they see. Again, this is sort of like the closest vessel. So they're going to snap a photo of that vessel with their smartphone, report some details. With that photo comes great information like geolocation, details about the vessel itself, all the information you might need, location. We're going to go ahead and pin that on the map, make sure it's right, and submit this. This can happen offshore as well. We don't have wireless. So we're going to submit that report. What happens next? Well, we can take that data, we have to figure out what to do with it. This is the analyze phase. This is an example of what Google's done with facial recognition. Salesforce has made some acquisitions with the same type of technology. We're going to apply it here. And the example is to take this vessel, we're going to strip out color. We're going to take a look at some of the characteristics of that vessel from a machine learning perspective. Turns out, vessels actually have a fingerprint. They have identifiable characteristics that don't change. So we're going to take a look at those, and the machine learning is going to take a look at those and map those against known photos, known artifacts from what this vessel has been tracked and inescapably can't change. So as it turns out, this is the vessel. Machine learning makes a match, and this is where the application takes a step into the workflow place, where it's actually going to take that information, it's going to alert out. It's going to say, okay, who needs to know about this? And this is what happens. So if I'm on the receiving end, I might be a local enforcement agency, I'm going to start getting a text message about the location, the details, what's happening, information that allows me to make instantaneous surveillance calls into that local port. I can log into Salesforce even, I can get more detail if I wanted to directly, and then be able to confirm that this is the right step. So this is technology that exists today. This is actually just taking a concept of enterprise technology and applying it in this construct. So there's actually nothing new here from a Salesforce perspective. So, and I'll toggle to the last slide here before we maybe wrap up on this section. So when we think about this problem, what you just saw was a demonstration using pretty much standard enterprise technology applied in a mobile context to look at ways to help solve this problem. That's not going to fix the problem. It's actually only going to be one additional element to helping to solve the problem, because we actually have to take that information, we have to share it, we have to collaborate with other known entities that are working in this space, and then figure out the best way or the number of ways to solve for the problem. And it's sort of like a death by 1,000 cuts in this space. And that was a quote from a blog post earlier this week. You know, the insurance industry, for instance, is looking at ways to stop this by no longer insuring these vessels, which makes it actually really difficult when that happens, for instance, to the vessel ends up on the bottom of the ocean. And as it turns out, the local governments have taken a really strong stance in this, but they have to know who's where that information resides. We have to be responsible how we share this information. There was a great section yesterday on talking about the data responsibility element. We have to be very responsible with this information because we are really involving citizens, we're involving individuals, fishermen, we're involving port captains, we're involving all sorts of individuals who wouldn't normally use a device to share this type of information, and we could be putting them at risk. So there's lots of considerations that we're talking about in terms of using this technology in a very responsible way, but also a very effective way. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, you want to?
That was great. I'm really excited about that. I'm really glad to hear about it. Good morning, everybody. My name's Brad Ack. I work for the World Wildlife Fund. I lead the Oceans program. And excuse my voice, I'm fighting a a cold, but it's much better today. Yesterday I sounded like Darth Vader, so today's an improvement. I'm excited to be with this group and to invite you into the world of ocean conservation and explore the urgent need for innovation like what we just heard here from Travis. And it's a space I've been working in for a long time, and one that is really in dire need of these kinds of tools and approaches. I'm going to start with an overview of why that's the case. This Living Planet report is a document that WWF puts out every couple of years. It's almost like a physical for the planet, a biannual physical, and the bottom line is really not good. So this graph with the downward line is an index of terrestrial, marine, and freshwater species. And between 1970 and 2010, there was a 52% decline in that index. So that is my generation presiding over what is a loss of almost half of the animals in that period of time, or of those populations. Now, we get numb to those kind of figures. We hear them all the time, but if we weren't numb to them, I think we'd follow God's lead here. And to put that in perspective, weep uncontrollably. Another way to look at the impact that we're having on the planet is to think about our footprint. We also do a footprint report in combination with a variety of other organizations. And looking at a 4-year period from 2010 to 2013, our use of resources on the planet and our use of the planet's ability to absorb our wastes actually totaled what would be about 1.5 Earths. So far more than we can sustainably produce. Now you might ask, well, how's that even possible? And the answer is, it's because you spend down your capital, like running down your bank account or your savings account, and because you degrade the surrounding systems. And as we rocket towards a population of 9.6 billion in 2050, that's the projection, we're looking at, if we stay on this current trajectory of the way we produce, consume, and dispose of resources that sustain our lifestyles, we're looking at a doubling of that footprint, almost a doubling of that footprint. Now we know that path is just not sustainable. There's no way that we can stay on that path and maintain a living planet. So this is the point in time where a massive shift is needed. And the only way we're going to get that shift is going to be through the kinds of innovation that Travis talked about, but many, many other kinds of innovation that are around our entire footprint. So what a lot of people don't realize is that oceans are really susceptible to this footprint. For most of human history, people just thought they were untouchable by human activity. But in fact, they have become extremely susceptible to our activities. And that's not a problem just for marine organisms. The oceans literally are the life support system for the planet. So they fuel the planetary water cycle that provides fresh water for all of us and all other living beings. They produce healthy, free food for billions of people, and have for a long, long time. They produce more than half of all the oxygen we breathe, so that's a really important one, and that's not given. That can actually be affected by our activities. They regulate our global climate, and they sustain livelihoods for hundreds of millions of people. So because of all those services, they're an asset that's worth a lot of money. And we tried this approach of talking to people in the business community about the asset value of oceans to see if we could get a response if we talked about it in those terms. And we did a study with the Boston Consulting Group that evaluated all these different services that the ocean provides, came out with a number of $24 trillion of an asset value, which includes all of those fish and coastal services of storm protection and that sort of thing, all of the shipping routes, and the functions of the various ocean ecosystems. So, you would think that with an asset value like that, we'd be taking pretty good care of this resource. But in fact, what was often thought too big to fail has become significantly impacted. This is a global map based on a study done in 2008 that looked at anthropogenic drivers of change in the ocean, 48 different activities that we do as people that lead to change in the oceans. And the color scale is that as you go from the, kind of hard to see on there, as you get more orange and towards red is a higher degree of impact. But if you just let your eyes wash over it, what you see is that we've had a lot of impact on the oceans, kind of like what you saw with that shipping map where the ships light up all across the ocean. We are all over the place in the ocean, and we're having a lot of impact on the ocean. And in fact, this study showed that something like 40% of the oceans were under heavy impact. And this was before we really realized that there's an existential threat to the oceans, which is our production of greenhouse gases, carbon most notably, which is leading to obviously atmospheric warming, but it's leading to ocean warming and significant increases in sea surface temperatures. It's leading to melting, which is rising sea levels, and increased storm surge and the inundation of a lot of coastal habitats. Aside from the warming, carbon is depositing directly in the oceans, which leads to acidification, and then you also have a problem of deoxygenation. So when we use the words existential threat, we don't do that lightly. This is just an image that shows how if you take any particular problem in the ocean, in this case it's shellfish production in an estuary, all of the different factors that come into play in trying to resolve that one problem. You've got a variety of different land-based and actually water-based sources of contaminants that can affect that shellfish bed. Now that's just one ocean issue. Take that to fishing, take it to protection of coral reefs, take it to maintaining a living Arctic, and you can see that every ocean problem has a lot of different components to it. And this is why we have to find breakthrough approaches and exponential approaches. As Morgan said in the beginning, the history of conservation has been about if we just set these areas aside and just sort of keep people away, we'll have nature and then we'll have civilization. And of course, we know that doesn't work. This is all one combined system. It's one biosphere, and what we have to do is figure out how we're going to survive along with everything else. So we recognize the need for innovation. Some time ago, we put our toe in the water on this through international competition that we called Smart Gear. We ran this globally, and it was designed to inspire people to think about how to redesign fishing gear so that it didn't have those bycatch impacts that Travis spoke about. Think of turtles in nets drowning. Think of sharks on long line rigs. And those were the kind of things that it was designed to avoid. And we ran this for 10 years. It was really interesting. People from around the world came up with ideas, mostly in the fishing community, for different kinds of gear that would avoid bycatch, and some of them were really impactful. But what we learned from this was that it wasn't good enough. It was too linear of a process. It didn't have an opportunity to incubate good ideas that weren't ready to win. So we had a lot of people come in with really interesting ideas, but they weren't ready to be winners, and we had no ability to work with them to build those ideas out. And then at the other end, most importantly, when we had winners, we didn't have any way to help them scale. And so we have decided that, I'm going to skip that slide. We decided to launch something to try and address those problems. And we call it Oceans X Labs. And it really tries to take a page from Silicon Valley and the kind of incubator accelerators that we've seen that have been so effective in bringing new businesses and technology-based businesses to market. So for conservation, this is a brand new model. Our idea is that we want to harness exponential technologies, accelerate the development of products and solutions based on those technologies, and then push those out, hopefully largely in profit-making enterprises out into the world to affect a lot of the issues that we're working on. So this platform, which has been launched, it's just in its startup phase and it's sort of a soft launch, is going to use a digital platform to source from solvers and makers and inventors worldwide solutions and the application of emergent technologies to a host of ocean conservation problems. And then it's going to help develop those ideas through a network of partnerships with technology companies and universities and science institutions, and maybe some of you, to take some of those most promising entrepreneurs and ideas and really help them go to scale. We have started with a support from the Australian government, around $2 million, $2.5 million on aquaculture as our first area of focus. Aquaculture is ocean farming, the creation of, farming of fish, happens on land, happens in the water. It has huge impacts on ocean ecosystems, in part because it depends on harvesting large amounts of wild fish, crushing them up into fish meal and fish oil, and then feeding them to these farmed fish. So one of the parts of this challenge is reinventing and redesigning fish feed away from using wild fish and to using algae and microbial-based sources. And there's competitions on right now. We have over 500 people registered to submit applications. About 125 have already been submitted. In fact, there's one or two here from Boston. It's an exciting challenge. The other part is to spur a revolution in the consumption of sea vegetables. So this is a part of aquaculture that could be really beneficial for the oceans, because seaweeds and other sea vegetables actually clean water. They take excess nitrogen out, they take carbon out. They're incredibly nutritious, and yet we don't eat them in any significant way. So part of this challenge is to create new foods from sea vegetables, and especially shelf-stable foods, so that they can be shipped and used in a variety of different foods. So think of a powder made from seaweed, which I have in my office desk. It's a 100-gram packet. 28 grams of it is protein. Think of that powder being used in all sorts of different applications to provide really incredibly nutritious food at a low price for this growing population and the food security problems that we have. After we trial this model of acceleration, incubation and acceleration around these aquacultures, we're turning to overfishing. That's our next area of challenge. This whole issue of electronic monitoring is a big part of that, and I think the application that Travis talked about would be a really cool idea to think about. Okay, how are we going to scale that? What is the business model for that? How do you get that all around the world? And there's a lot of other people working on those. It's not just illegality in the area of overfishing, it's also basic science. We don't know what fish stocks are, so if you don't know what they are, it's impossible to know whether you're overfishing them, so we need that. There's a lot of pieces to this. And then there's a whole series of other challenges. So we've done, as part of our design phase for this incubator, a document called 10 Grand Challenges for Ocean Conservation. You can find it on our website. There will be many other things to work on. And so here's where my plea goes out to those of you who've worked in this space and worked on innovation and social innovation and impact innovation. Any lessons you have, any ideas about what works and what doesn't with incubators and accelerators, and access to finance and impact investors, would love to hear. Anybody who's interested in being part of this would love to hear about it as well. And so with that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Awesome. So Brad, I guess a question for you is, when did you guys realize you sort of had to be embracing sort of new ideas and new models? I mean, I guess you said it started 10 years ago with the fishing thing, but so what has taken so long to get to this? Or was there some sort of catalyst like, oh my God, what we're doing isn't working?
It's a really good question. I think it's just not in our comfort zone, right? Most conservation organizations are made up, a lot of them are made up of scientists. They're not business people necessarily. There's a lot of people that have entrepreneurial spirit, but they're not thinking about the application of private sector approaches to conservation. And I have to tell you, there's resistance. This incubator accelerator that we're trying to launch is designed to focus on private companies, right? Innovators who want to make money, because that is what really drives change, right? If somebody has an idea, they want to make big impact, social change, but they also want to make a living, and they're going to be the ones who are the champion and go out and really sell this hard. Those are the people we want to find. A lot of what we did in Smart Gear was open source. So we came up with great technologies and put them out there, but there was private companies in those spaces keeping them out, right? So for us, working with private sector companies it's challenging. It's legally challenging as a nonprofit organization, but it's also intellectually challenging, and it's a challenge that we're sort of have come around to and embraced now, but it's taken a while.
Travis, did you find any of that conflict while you were working with Oceana?
Yeah,
I think so. I mean, I think when we think about innovation, I heard this yesterday, is this sort of linear versus networked approach to innovation. The examples of linear innovation exist everywhere. I think our natural tendencies as human beings are to, do what you do well, and rarely venture out. And I think that in this space around conservation, you have a group of people who are really good with technology and applying the principles of mobile and social and building great stacks of architecture that accomplish amazing things in the private sector. Then you have this giant team of conservationists, environmentalists, and people that are living and breathing the environment of kind of saving the ocean, saving the earth. And the two rarely cross between. So what's interesting is, for the project that we worked on, it was sort of a computer geek, that would be me, working with a scientist from UCSB, and just sharing thoughts on, well, what if we did this? Would that work? I think that was very eye-opening to me, how little, there was kind of exposure, how little exposure there was in sort of the academic space for conservation around technology, where we've been solving problems like this for a long time in the private space.
Let's talk about scale and scaling for a minute. I mean, just specifically about your thing, do you have a sense of sort of like what the critical mass is of the number of people who need to be using the app for it to start really working and seeing network effects?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, for the example that we're using here, I think that it probably wouldn't take a lot, right? And I think the model is built in such a way that we can actually do a lot with very little bits of information, particularly when we think about that networked effect and working with a lot of other organizations. So this is not a standalone effort. This isn't, hey, we had this great idea, we're going to deploy it, and then hope for the best and see what happens. This is, in fact, that's why we're still in the process of building the app out. We are iterating through lots and lots of different ideas. We're bringing in more groups. Hey, I heard you working on this. Tell us what you're doing. Could you do this? Could you do it this way? Could you integrate with this system? So I think there's just sort of the iteration phase has taken a lot longer for us to kind of come up with that MVP, so that we can kind of come up with what is that thing that we can do when we launch that will make the kind of the biggest impact for the lowest cost, and just to sort of allow us to change direction, course correct as quickly as possible.
And is part of that sort of specific plans and how to get it into the hands of these governments and enforcement agencies? What's going on with that?
Yeah, ultimately that's the plan, right? This is the connection between really anyone, right? A citizen, as we call a citizen conservationist, somebody who cares. Frankly, the name of the application, Mazu, the Chinese god of seafarers, right? So we're actually building this in the tension that, to your point, that we believe that the largest adopter of a technology like this is probably somebody who's following the rules. Their livelihood depends on following the rules. And we're looking at protecting the rights of those who are spending most of their day, or all of their day, thinking about ways to stay within regulation, do the right thing, and every time that we lose one of the people that are kind of working in that sense over to like the dark side of doing something illegal, then it makes it that much harder to bring them back.
Interesting. Brad, what about scaling your idea? I mean, I know you have one example of an idea not scaling that well. What do you think is keeping these from scaling? What is your sort of new plan for the new ideas to take them to a better uptick level?
As I said, I think part of it really is linking conservation with business and entrepreneurs and innovators who are really passionate about their approach. And we've seen this, on this alternatives to fish meal, there are some really interesting things out there around algae and microbes, microbe-based approaches to creating feed that people who are doing them are super excited about, and they want to disrupt that whole field. And that's not, we don't just feed fish meal and fish oil to fish, we feed them to chicken and pigs as well. So a big part of our agricultural system is based on this harvesting, mass harvesting of wild fish. So these approaches are really interesting, but think about the companies that they're going to have to disrupt if they're going to get in that space. That's the problem. There are already established providers in each of these spaces, and they have power and weight. So that's a critical piece. You got to figure that out, and you got to think about how that happens. And part of that happens through social movements, right? That people get behind this because, hey, did you know that you're eating chicken fed by fish? Do you really want to do that? We have no idea where those fish even come from. And so getting some of the social media platforms behind some of this kind of thing helps to make these shifts. but we're going to have to disrupt a lot of industries if we're going to get back to a economy that doesn't eat away at the very life support systems of the planet, right? We're going to have to disrupt big oil in a big way and fast, and we've seen that with companies like First Solar and others, and Solar City, and others. That's what we have to get. We have to get disruption. It has to go fast. It's got to be supported by social media, and we've got to get a lot of investors behind it. So another part that I didn't mention about our model, we're trying to use crowdsourced funding as well, which has been obviously, part of this whole conference, really effective for a lot of people here. We haven't used it in the conservation movement, hardly at all. So we're really excited about what Classy's done and learning from that and learning from what a lot of other people here have done.
So that leads to another question. What resources do you feel like you need to make this work that you're not getting, I guess, and how can we help you get them?
That's great. So first of all, the sourcing piece is really interesting. The slide that I skipped over were 3 different really cool inventions out of the in the area of health. One was a technique for helping prevent breech births, deaths in the third world. And it was a really low-tech idea that came from an Argentinian car mechanic who had basically seen this party trick where you put a cork all the way inside a bottle, and then you extract the cork by sticking a plastic bag all the way in the bottle and pulling it out. Don't know if you've ever seen this party trick, but this guy said, wow, that could work with breech bursts, and he created this thing that won a World Health Organization prize. So one of the things we need is just to get our problems out there to people, because you have no idea where the solution is going to come from, right? So sourcing is really big. But then when something comes in like that, so he came in with the idea, a lot of people had to help him figure out, now how do you turn that into a low-cost, manufacturable product that we can scale across the third world, right? So let's think about 3D printing, and like some of the cool applications we've seen out there in the hall around prosthetics. How are we going to get this around to a lot of people? And then let's make sure that we're working with World Health Organization and all the other health organizations to make sure they understand this scary new approach and that it's actually not scary. So we need help throughout that entire process. And we're looking really for a lot of partners who want to give what they have in abundance, which is knowledge. Rather than asking people for money, we're asking people, hey, if you want to be involved in this, what kind of technical skills might you have that we could call on when somebody like this guy comes in with this wacky idea and say, hey, what do you think? Could this work? Could you help him design it? So those are the kind of things that we're looking at building out.
Speaking of asking for knowledge, I'd love to know what the process is like when people approach Salesforce.org. How did you decide that this one is the one you were going to work on? What do people need to do to convince you?
So Mark Benioff emailed me, I think. No, actually, seriously. The story behind that was actually that Mark Benioff's the CEO of Salesforce, had a kind of a great conversation with Dr. Douglas McCauley, who is a researcher at UCSB. And Dr. McCauley is extremely passionate about the ocean. He's leading a number of research programs around it. And Mark had a conversation with him and said, we can help. He said, I think our technology can completely help that situation. And I think that's kind of how we got engaged. And then it was sort of interesting to see how, in the world of, kind of in the vein of social media and media in general, the role that these projects have with the media. If you look at Boy and Slap and the ocean cleanup, if you haven't seen what he's done, he's a young gentleman who has built a plan to effectively attempt to clean up the ocean in large swaths using technology in the open ocean, and clean up the Pacific Ocean garbage patch in particular is the one that he's focused on.
He's like 16, right?
He's a little older than 16.
He was 16 when
he started.
About 24 now.
Yeah, he's about 24 now, and he's a really bright mind, and he worked for a long time in the very beginning of his project just to kind of get to that point of escape velocity, right? So he had $200 to spend on this project. He had some fame around being young, but really he hadn't done anything until he hit kind of the TED circuit of speaking about the problem. Then all of a sudden he had $80,000 to start working with that and growing that, and then he became relatively famous in the world of conservation. His challenges aren't over. He's still trying to figure out exactly how to solve the problem with technology, and I like his quote that he said that he's not testing it to prove himself right in terms of his theory. He's actually just testing it to see what doesn't work. And eventually he'll come across something that I'm sure that does. So I think that's kind of the case with a lot of what we're doing is it's kind of easy to be critical of what we're doing and easy to critical say that could never work. The problem's too big, the ocean's too big, the government will get in the way, and so on. But I think having the support of the media and support of whether it's, in my case, Mark Benioff as a CEO or having support from the broader media around these challenges, I think consistently show that when you have the weight of people behind you, it really helps to move things forward.
All right. Speaking of the weight of people, we're going to take some audience questions, if anyone has any.
If you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll...
Thank you. I'm Namrita Kapoor with Environmental Defense Fund. And getting back to the question of oceans and oceans protection, we've seen a really important piece of that is getting good fisheries management systems in place in the downstream side of things, if you will. I'm just wondering, what role do you see that technology can play in helping move that along? Because it tends to be right now a very, getting good governance in place and working with stakeholders and understanding sort of allocations of rights and those sorts of things that it's a little difficult for me to see kind of exactly how the technology could help accelerate that process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can take a cut at that. I totally agree that good fisheries management is essential to sustainable fishing. We work on that. That's a core area that we work on. I think that a lot of countries don't have basic stock assessments and the ability to do stock assessments because the way that we do them in the developed world is really expensive. So technology that allows us to more rapidly assess the health and status of fish stocks will go a long way towards fisheries management. Some of these low-priced handheld-based communications and surveillance tools I think is also a really important piece. Catch documentation is a thing that doesn't happen in much of the developing world, just knowing what's being caught and assessing it so that you can understand kind of not only what the health of the target population is, but what the bycatch rates are and so forth. And so we're working on some low-cost electronic approaches to catch documentation. So I think it's a field that's ripe for technology disruption and support.
Hi, so I actually have a couple of questions. It seems like the problem with ocean conservation is exceptionally vast, both in terms of the degree of exploitation and then also the ignorance in some of the people who are doing the exploitation. So do you think that bigger types of surveillance, like for example Air Shepherd and the drones and what they're doing with the poaching, would that be something that ultimately could be effective in this fight? Or do you think that it is so vast that even that technology is way too far from where it needs to be effective?
Do you want to take?
Yeah, so I'll take the first stab at that. So we're working with Pew Research as part of the project that we're talking about and in the prototype, and they are in partnership with a group called Catapult. And Catapult runs a massive bank of satellites that fly over the ocean and take massive numbers of images of the ocean and where these vessels are. And then they use kind of computational elements to look at anomalistic behavior of vessels overlaid with what they call AIS, which is vessel positioning. So, and when I saw this, it was almost like something out of a 24 episode. It actually was real though. And when you look at what they're doing, they're just sort of looking at images overlaid with data, and they have 4 or 5 layers of data they look at to see, is that thing supposed to be where it's at? And as it turns out, they can look at the sky, from the sky down very, very well, and you can see a lot of things that are happening. But to Air Shepherd's credit, what they have is a much more detailed view of what's happening at that last mile. And what we're hoping to be able to provide from a mobile perspective is the same thing. So, is it indeed that thing that's happening out there? Can we snap photos of it and essentially be able to have verification? It's kind of hard to take satellite photos to court. Much easier to take an actual video or an actual image of a vessel. And we're kind of thinking about ways to even use drone technology to capture a 360-degree view of a vessel where it's at in place so that effectively there is zero chance of a misidentification. You effectively have every angle of that vessel at 60 frames a second. So I think it's a combination of technologies, both from the sky, near sky, and on the ground that can really help to get a better picture of where things have gone wrong.
The only thing I would add to that is we also have to have really effective regulatory frameworks in countries that import fish. So
Yeah.
the U.S. is just about to adopt a new framework for getting black market fish out of the U.S., and that's really critical. The EU already has such a system. We need one in Japan and in China and the other big seafood importing nations, because right now the studies, and Oceana does these all the time, that you go into any supermarket and you actually do DNA testing of what's labeled in your store, and you find about 30% is mislabeled. Fraud, some of that's illegal. So we're consuming this illegal fish, and as long as we keep consuming it, there's always going to be people who will find a way to beat the system. On the other hand, transparency is going to be the watchword, obviously, of this century. It's going to be harder and harder to hide anything from anybody, and so governments can clearly stop illegal fishing if they just have the political will to do it.
Right there.
Hi, I work in tropical forest conservation for an organization called Nature and Culture International, and I'm curious, beyond drone technology, what you think are some of the most promising technologies available for land and wildlife conservation.
For land and wildlife conservation? Well, I think there's a lot of work on illegality in timber and in wildlife trade, and a lot of it's not just drones, but there's all kinds of surveillance and monitoring that's out there. It's a good question. I think sometimes we actually have to move away from the actual site of what we're talking about trying to work with to think about what the alternatives are. So, for example, what kind of alternatives are we going to invent to the use of tropical hardwoods in products that we like to consume? How are we going to use social media and behavioral campaigns to get China to stop wanting to consume rhino horn and fish gallbladders and all kinds of things like that? So I think there's a lot of other ways. We're just at the beginning of trying to explore how to use different approaches to do the job. So I wish I had more clear and specific answers for you, but that's really what we're trying to ramp up.
All right, one more.
Mike Gravitz with the Marine Conservation Institute. We've worked a lot on the issue of IU fishing, and this question is for Mr. Ack. Our experience with NOAA is that they are really technological laggards other than in the weather and satellite area. Their fisheries folks just really are slow to adopt new technologies, including things like automated sailboats, aerial drones, other kinds of things for monitoring and enforcement of IU fishing laws. And now that we've got an international agreement, the Port States Measures Agreement, that's coming into effect, and there are 30 countries and hopefully be more in the near future, what can we do to try to get NOAA and the National Marine Fisheries Service to be a little more proactive in terms of using new technologies so that they can take advantage of this new treaty and agreement?
That's a tough question. I'm not sure what we can do to get that agency to decide to be more to adopt technology more quickly. Perhaps what we need to do is really better understand from within the perspective of the agency what their constraints are, what their frontline people deal with. I think part of, as we go into this frame of designing technology to improve conservation, we have to know who the users are, and we have to make sure that we're designing it in a way that's useful for them. We're working with the U.S. government in this IUU framework on a trusted trader program, which would allow companies who are doing the right thing and who have the technology to be able to prove where they've caught fish and that it's been tracked all the way through their supply chains, to be able to get their fish into the U.S. much more easily. It's kind of like the TSA pre-line at the airport. And they seem pretty willing to accept what the private sector can prove. So maybe that's, in some ways that's what we need with NOAA, is to show them what others are doing and how it could make their lives easier, and hope that they'll adopt. But I don't have a better answer for it, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
One more?
Yes, we have
All
one
right.
more question from Twitter, which is, what can we as everyday citizens do to help curb the pillaging of our oceans? How can we sort of make an impact with our own wallets, say at the grocery store or in our everyday lives?
Well, for me, the first one across everything we do is, where does the stuff I consume come from? What's its origin? Is it legal? Is it sustainable? Ask your grocer or your seller of home furniture or whatever it is. Ask them that. That's where the whole sustainable timber trade started, was when people started asking Home Depot, where's this stuff coming from? This is coming from endangered forests in Borneo. So that's the first thing. Know where your products come from. Make sure they're legal. Make sure they're sustainable. Asking those questions has a big impact. And then know what you're doing with the products that you discard. Where are these things going? So much of what we discard is ending up in our oceans, including the stuff that goes through our bodies. There was a study in Puget Sound recently of salmon that were contaminated with things like Lipitor and caffeine and even cocaine. All these things that are flowing through our bodies, it's just incredible. But the stuff we put in the trash, we just think it's gone. It's not. So, think about how to have your own life be more circular to the extent that you can. The old reduce, reuse, recycle is, it's a proven adage, and it really is true.
Yeah, I'd add, check out Seafood Watch on the App Store, online. Seafood Watch has a really great local kind of view into the different things that are showing up in your grocery store. They're a very reputable source of information on what to buy when you go to a Japanese restaurant or when you go to the grocery store. Worth checking out. I think as well, if you have kids, take them to the beach. Get them to know, help them understand how valuable this environment is. Teach them about maybe what you learned today or what you learn online about conservation, thinking about the ocean. I mean, I have 2 kids. My 8-year-old daughter, I probably should have put her photo on the slide that showed all the people. She helped build this out. She talks about it at school. She's kind of a leader in her class talking about this. Teach your kids about what this means, why it's important. I think that's kind of helps the thinking about the future and for the
Absolutely.
the future generations.
Very good.
Awesome, guys. All right, thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.